Good afternoon. The sessions this morning were just fantastic. I'll self-introduce. I'm Steve Delphin. I'm the CEO of America's Charities, and thank you all for joining us. A great little lunch we had. And again, has anybody popped upstairs yet? You've been outside? Anybody been outside at all? Just to get a breathe? Well, don't, because you're going to be very unhappy. It's absolutely gorgeous out. The room's clearing, as I see. Close those doors back there. We're really honored to have with us today Marc Gunther as our lunchtime speaker. And actually, Marc and I are going to do a little Q&A. I've watched him do this in a couple other formats, and when I asked him if he'd be interested in speaking here, he said, I really like the Q&A format. I like to get engaged with the audience. So that's the format we're going to have. Let me quickly introduce Marc. He's a veteran journalist, speaker, and a writer. And he's focused on business and sustainability has been his issue. He's a contributing editor for Fortune magazine, a senior writer at greenbiz.com, and a blogger in the Energy Collective. Is that correct, Marc? I got that all right?
Correct.
He's also a husband and father, a lover of the outdoors, and a marathon runner. I can tell you he's a runner because he and I had lunch and prep for this, and we had to cut it short because it was a day like this, and he says, I got to go for a run. And he did. He might have been running away from me. I don't know. Marc's an author and co-author of 4 books, including Faith and Fortune, How Compassionate Capitalism is Transforming American Business. And that's really kind of the core of the discussion today, with a focus on how does that translate into the broader discussion we're having around employee engagement. He's also a skilled moderator and speaker and has appeared before corporate audiences and at numerous conferences. In fact, where I know Marc is he and I both served on the advisory board. I believe you were on the advisory board of Net Impact, or were you?
No, I'm actually still on the board.
Still on the board of Net Impact, which is an organization I think we'll talk about a little bit more in our discussions here today. But I've watched Marc speak and moderate, and his knowledge on corporate social responsibility is amazing. In fact, he's thoughtful and insightful. And I think one of only a handful of the mainstream communicators writing on the subject, is he turning red over there, on the topic of social responsibility in a way that it both combines, the kind of a traditional look at it, but also looking at what's happening in terms of trends in the area of social responsibility. What I would ask you all to do in the audience is, as we speak up here and go back and forth, if you have questions, either A, write them down because we'll leave ample time for Q&A, or B, I think Marc, we might want to try to engage you as we go. So if you have a question or you want Marc to elaborate on something, or if I said something you want us to elaborate on, just raise your hand and let's get it out there so we can talk about it. Does that sound good for ground rules? And if you could, please turn off cell phones and all those fun. You don't have to turn them off, but no sound, please. So here we go. I got a bunch of questions for you, Marc. You ready?
Go for it, yeah.
All right, here we go, man. Your bio says you're a journalist, that you're a speaker and a writer, but when we talked about this event, you said, I really am not an expert on employee engagement. So as we spoke a little more, I talked to you about the 4 pillars of successful engagement, and you said you saw how that connected to your broader role and interest in the area of corporate social responsibility and sustainable business models. So I'd like to start our discussion today by asking 2 questions, and the first one is, can you tell us a little bit about how and why you got started writing on social responsibility and sustainability? And second, can you give us your perspective on why social responsibility, including the contemporary models we're talking about in employee engagement strategy, is critical to business success now and in the future?
Okay.
Fastball.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me, Steve, and thank you all for inviting me to come today. So how I got involved in it actually is a long story, but the short version is I'm older than I look. I turned 50 in 2001. Had a kind of a... I don't know why that's even funny.
Nobody believes you.
So I did. Had a bit of a sort of midlife thing going on. Did some religious searching of my own through different faith traditions, eventually reconnected with my own tradition, which was Judaism, and began to think, because I was writing at the time full-time at Fortune, about the intersection of religion and business. So I set out to do a story about people in big companies, because we cover big companies at Fortune, who were deeply religious people from a variety of faith traditions. And the hypothesis of the story was there would be a tension between the demands of Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam, and the demands of the marketplace. You know, if you're going to love your brother as yourself, what happens on the day you have to lay off your brother? And who is your brother? Isn't it that employee over in China working for 10 cents an hour making iPhones, as well as the person in the cubicle next door? So somewhat shaped by my 1960s view of the world, even though I was a writer at Fortune, kind of skeptical about the role of business in society, I set out to find these tensions between religious people and business people. And surprisingly, because usually when you start with a hypothesis of a story, you end up proving the hypothesis. In this case, that's a terrible indictment of journalism, but it's true. In this case, I really ended up turning my hypothesis completely upside down. As I met some of the people I wrote about in the story in Fortune, which eventually ran on the cover in 2001 under the headline God and Business, which is not a typical Fortune cover story, I found that they were engaged, aligned, successful, and that there was really not a tension between these traditional sort of spiritual or religious values that cross traditions and success in the business world, that in fact the ability to be centered and have a sense of purpose and have a strong moral foundation drove their success. And my leap from there, and that's not to say it's easy, but my leap from there was to say, well, what about companies that are shaped by those same sets of values? What about companies that actually, you know, live the rhetoric of employees being an important resource, or live the rhetoric about serving their communities? Wouldn't they then also be the most successful? And this is a very difficult thing to prove, but again, in the course of writing that story and then continuing to write about and research and think about this set of issues, I came to believe that that was true too, that there wasn't really a tension between these aspirational values and market capitalism, that there was perhaps a tension between short-term capitalism and long-term capitalism, but that business and faith could in fact be aligned. That led to the book, and that's sort of the question I've been thinking about and writing about in various different ways for the last 11 years now.
Well, let's drill into that a little bit more. You talk about leadership and how you turned the hypothesis upside down as where you ended up. So if that's where you ended up, talk to us a little bit about the importance of leadership in building an institution that values those values that you identified. And what is it about those leaders that you saw specifically that made them unique? And maybe I'll do a pile-on question is, can socially responsible leadership be learned, or is it innate?
Well, that's about 3 different questions.
Yeah, but well, I'm having fun. You're the journalist, so I get to now turn it back on you.
Just a tip, Steve, a moderator, 1 question at a time, because otherwise the answer can duck 2 of the 3 if they want.
You, Henry Kissinger. Anybody have any questions for my answers? I know. Okay.
So leadership. I guess the way I would think about that is by saying there are really, if you look at the corporate leaders, corporate cultures that get this whole idea, that buy into the idea that, to use all the cliches, you can do well by doing good, or that corporate social responsibility is a driver of business value. So the companies that are, I would say, in the forefront of that fall into 2 different categories. One is companies that for some reason were just born that way, that they had a founder who, even long before the term social responsibility was used or sustainability was used, just had a sense of a company doing service, that was why they got into the business in the first place. So what would be a couple of examples of that? An old company that I wrote about in the book that was built on that set of values was UPS. A slightly newer company, but still now probably 40 years old, was Southwest Airlines. Timberland would be another one where the Jeff Swartz and his family were very imbued with a sense of social justice and service and commitment to their employees and their communities. So that's one set where it's kind of built into the DNA from day one. And I think the people coming up in those companies, yes, they learn leadership because that's what the culture is all about. That's sort of the way we do things around here, is kind of the way you would put it at a UPS, say. It's not formalized. I don't think they have a big CSR department. It's just sort of who they are. The other companies that are leaders are the ones that get whacked, you know? So not, you know, I'm a genuine admirer of GE, but they didn't, you know, the Hudson River is not a happy place in some places today because of things that they, again, before the science was clear, you know, dumped in the Hudson River. You know, Walmart certainly had a huge reputational problem before they embraced their sustainability initiative. Nike would be another example, you know, big issues with labor in Vietnam and China in the 90s, kind of a come to their senses moment, realizing that that was a risk. And so I would say GE and Walmart and Nike are all leaders, and I assume that their CEOs are all leaders in this arena because they get the business model. I mean, and I'll just interject one more thing, because when I wrote the book about religion and business, it really, the argument here is not like that nicer people run nicer companies, or that CEOs today are in any way more enlightened or better people than the CEOs of the 50s. It's that society's expectations of business have changed, and therefore the smarter companies are those that meet those expectations and anticipate those expectations. And probably the number one driver of all those expectations and of this whole movement, if you want to call it that, is employees, because people come to work with much higher expectations than they did 20, 30, 50 years ago. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And let me ask you a kind of a follow-up question that really wasn't in the things we talked about in advance, but we talked a little bit at the table over here. We've heard in a couple of the sessions this morning about the new types of employees. So I was thinking about this myself, and I'm going to put forth a hypothesis and ask you to react to it, which is there were 4 or 5 seminal events in my lifetime that I think have led to today's engaged employee. The first one was Earth Day, which was 1970, which was when I was a senior in high school. And I'm not in any particular order. The second one, I think, and maybe it was a combination, were some of the first cause marketing events that engaged young individuals, like Hands Across America. Third was, believe it or not, the Reagan White House, when they created the Private Sector Initiative Task Force and created Points of Light Foundation, put an emphasis on voluntarism, all of which led up to a period of time in the early 1980s when public schools started to put into their curriculum volunteer service. So do the math, that'd be 1981, 82. Those are our young employees today. That's my son, who's 30. That's your daughter, who's 28. So I put that out as a hypothesis or an observation, and I just like your thoughts on it.
I don't know exactly what you mean when you say engaged employees, so maybe that would, do you mean engaged in the work that they're being paid to do, or engaged in society, or both?
They have a higher expectation of what the employer will do to enable them to be engaged in their interests outside the workplace, specifically interests that relate to community development, outside charitable organizations, so to empower them and give them the tools and the ability to execute on that desire.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about this. All of you are much more, you know, expert on this than I am, but I think if we're talking about sort of voluntarism, the fact that both my daughters had to do a service requirement to graduate from high school leads them to learn by experience at an early age that going out and, you know, working on a habitat project or a soup kitchen or whatever the case may be, you end up feeling better and feeling rejuvenated, and it was a good experience, and so you get into the habit of doing that. So there might be a higher expectation of of your employer giving you the opportunity to do that, you know, as you enter the workforce. I mean, I think the broader issue, though, is that, you know, as we've become, my parents, you know, parents' generation, which is sort of the World War II generation, the cliche, which is probably only partly true, is, you know, stay with the same employer, go out, get the gold watch. Security becomes really your number one, you know, desire from work. I would say the baby boomers kind of up the ante a little bit, and they want some security and some meaning. And a few years ago, Fortune ran a cover story on the generation of 20-something employees now who essentially really grew up, these are my kids, in a very affluent world. You know, self-esteem was kind of the watchword of parenting. And the headline on the story was, "You raised them, now manage them." And yeah, they arrive at the workplace, for better or worse, with sometimes really outsized expectations of, you know, who's working for who here. But nevertheless, the really good ones are ones you want to find a way to keep engaged, and you know, that's your competitive advantage.
So you talk about this in your book, and you've talked about this in your blog and writing, and we have all these organizations and businesses and nonprofits that are doing consulting and supporting the business case for embracing employee engagement and corporate social responsibility. What's changed in the last decade? When you first started really writing about this, has the environment really changed? And if so, how?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly this more expansive view of the role of a business, which in a way is, I think, what corporate social responsibility is about. It sort of says, you know, the role of a business is not just to, you know, engage in transactions and charge people as little as, you know, charge people as much as you can, and squeeze your suppliers and squeeze your employees, and, you know, extract as much value and put it in the bank. That's, again, a kind of gross exaggeration, but the sort of assembly line model, transactional way of thinking about a business. I think that has changed, so companies now do see, you know, the value of building relationships with their employees, with their suppliers, with their customers that are durable. I mean, I think that's my way of thinking about a business, that the value of the business is in that set of sort of durable win-win relationships, and community and stakeholders, I guess, would be part of that. So I do think the thinking has changed. You know, having said that, you know, I think when I wrote the first article about God and business, it was right after Enron and WorldCom and what was Tyco, you know, those sort of accounting scandals of the 2000-2001 time. So that was the clear evidence that companies that didn't have any real cultures or values would explode eventually, or implode. And now we've kind of been through that again in 2008, 2009, where, you know, the mortgage crisis suggested, again, a very short-term transactional model would blow itself up. So have things fundamentally changed? I don't know. I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about it. I'd actually, you want to do a quick poll?
Sure.
All right, how many people, you're all working in big companies, how many do you think, compared to 2001, so 11 years later, raise your hand if you think your company has in some meaningful way changed the way it thinks about or practices business today versus 10, 12 years ago? Wow, okay. Maybe
Looks like you've got a blog. You've got a blog here.
Yeah, it was about I'd say that was about 60-40.
Wow.
Good.
Well, yeah, let's play on that.
We should take some questions soon.
Well,
too.
we will. We got a couple more here. So, well, actually,
I don't mean to cut you out.
No. I mean, we have kind of explored some of the basic premises and heard Marc talk a little bit and reflect on some of the things you all have already talked some about this morning. Do we have any questions or comments at this point, or do you want us to keep rolling? Nothing yet? Okay. Let me. you and I met through Net Impact, and for those of you who don't know Net Impact, and it's not meant to be an endorsement, but I am endorsing them because I think it's a fantastic organization. And what they are is they are current MBA students who are interested in social responsibility. That's what Net Impact does. And
a little more, Steve, because now, since you were on the board,
That's right.
it's actually college students, undergraduates as well, and Net Impact also has professional chapters.
Well, and I was
So,
going to say on the
yeah.
alumni side, which I think is a really exciting part because they've reconnected to their original base. But what's happened is when I first went to their conference in 2000 at Flagler Business School, there were 200. It was a room about this big. That's how many people were there. When Mark and I were in Portland, Oregon in November, there were 2,000 people in the convention center. 2,000. And I got to tell you, the program is not people speaking to these students. This is a program of brilliant people around social responsibility, but many of them are the students themselves and the alumni. And so my question is, as we consider the role and the value of employee engagement in the social responsibility matrix, what do companies and what should they be doing, if I could ask you to form an opinion, to capture this surge in interest by young adults that are the best and the brightest in the business world in upping the game around social responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I love the organization. I'm only on 2 boards, one local one, and then on the board of Net Impact. And if your companies haven't paid some attention to it, I would really encourage you to take a look. And so when I wrote the book, and again in writing or talking about corporate social responsibility, I usually list 3 or 4, even 5 different drivers for companies, and they would include more conscious or ethical consumers. They would include, these are all things people in this room probably know. They would include, reputational risks. They would include, planning ahead for rising commodity prices. So, don't be too oil and gas dependent. Anyway, there's a long list. But I really think it's not that much more complicated than it ends up being about not only getting, but keeping and getting the most you can out of the best people. And Net Impact, it is inspirational to go to these conferences. We've had like 2,000 to 3,000 people at each of the last 3 or 4, and these are, and this is also a great thing from when, again, I came out of college, which was 1973. It's only a slight oversimplification to say that people who had a strong sense of social conscience or service, who got out of college in that era, it was still the 60s and the early 70s, were going to go to government, or they were going to go to nonprofits, or they were going to become school teachers, or they were going to join the Peace Corps, and it was kind of the, C student fraternity types who would end up going into business. So today, it's really not like that. The idealistic, passionate, people who want to have an impact on the world are starting their own companies, they're joining big companies. They really do see business as a lever of social change and a driver of economic growth. And I think that's such a much more healthy, enlightened view than the one that we had. And I think the ability to connect with those people is what's going to separate the successful company of 5, 10, 15 years from now from the one that is stagnating. And again, it's not just attracting them, it's having people go to work with a sense of energy and purpose and say, I really believe in what this company is doing. I really think we're solving important problems. I think we're, creating wealth. We're, doing all the things that companies can do, and that needs to be kind of in front of mind when people walk in the door in the morning.
So there's a company that comes to mind is one that you and I both know in Washington, D.C. called Honest Tea.
Oh, yeah, it's a small company.
It's a small, well, and it is,
part of a big company.
Part of a big company, and that's part of the interesting journey they've been on. So, Seth, we both know the founder of Honest Tea, Seth Goldman, who, of course, we met on where the Net Impact Board.
Actually, I met him at my synagogue, but that's okay.
Okay, well, that's ruining my story. Come on, Mark. And I know we're both friends of Seth. I don't know that we're both personal close friends, but I know you know about the journey. And his company is one that was started basically out of B school when he was in journalism. I mean, in business school. I was a journalism major, sorry about that. And has now grown into an interesting enterprise that has social responsibility at its core. So rather than me tell you about it, let me ask you to talk about Marc.
Well, again, this is, there's like, I don't know about hundreds, but there's certainly dozens of these sort of mission-driven companies which sprung up in the 80s and 90s, Honest Tea being one of them. And these, again, were people who said, I want to start a company and change the world and do things differently, probably with, Ben and Jerry's being kind of the grandfather of all of them. So it's interesting what they've done. They buy all organic ingredients. They're really conscious about the sustainability of their packaging. All of their employees, until recently, were owners. They sold a majority of the company to Coca-Cola, which is another story in the last few years. But they brought a set of values in creating the company that really were, strong social and environmental values. But the thing that's cool about these companies, because they're all frankly pretty small, is their ethic has percolated upwards. So, seventh generation Jeffrey Hollander's company until a couple of years ago when he got kicked out, unfortunately, they were the first company to disclose everything in their cleaning products, so that if you, buy something and clean your rug or your counter and you have a kid and you want to make sure everything in there is okay, you know what it is. Well, today, SC Johnson and I think to a large degree Procter & Gamble and the other big cleaning products have all become very transparent because, if the small company says it can be done, they have no reason to say they can't do it. The original, argument was like, oh, our competitors will steal our secret formula. But I mean, any chemist could go buy Windex and figure out what went into it in about 15 minutes. But in general, I think these small startups have really, again, helped shape this idea that business can be, a force for making a positive difference, and that's percolated up because big companies have to compete with these folks, not so much for customers, but again, I think for talent.
Well, and I think in Honest Tea's case, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, they've actually very early on in this kind of merger of cultures, kind of locked horns a little bit with the Coca-Cola culture and won, from what I understand.
Yeah, they had a little battle about corn syrup, where they wanted to put on the label contains no, I forget the actual word for it, but there's a term for fructose, thank you, high fructose corn syrup. And of course, Coca-Cola is like, hey, what's wrong with high fructose corn syrup? You don't want to market that that's bad. So yeah, there are challenges in these mergers. I mean, one of my favorites is on the bottles of PepsiCo's green little juice company. I'm pretty sure it's Naked Juice. They say, we don't include any GMOs because of our philosophical opposition to genetically modified organisms. Where did that come from?
I have a follow-up. You just made everyone's conference. That's perfect. Continue.
They call it Naked Juice. I'm sure that's why it got in my head. Anyway, that was a stupid thing for Naked Juice to put on the bottle, the word philosophical. They could say, we don't put GMOs in because we're appealing to dark green consumers and they don't like GMOs. But when you say philosophical opposition and then you call PepsiCo, which sells, Fritos corn chips, which is GMO corn, and say, so what is your philosophical opposition to GMOs? They don't really have a good answer. But I only bring it up just to say that yes, there are tensions between the kind of pure values of the mission-driven startups and the more pragmatic approach of the big companies. But despite that, I think those small companies have had an impact in a good way on the big ones.
We have a question right here. Vicky.
I think one of the interesting things with Seth and Honest Tea is absolutely, sorry. So I think one of the interesting things for Seth and Honest Tea is how much he's gone out of his way to help other small companies that have similar philosophies. And so really growing that concept of you can do business and do good at the same time. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah, it's really, you're right. These companies are kind of a community of themselves. Like at the Net Impact Conference, I did a panel with Seth and the Jason Graham Nye, who started this company, G Diapers, and someone from Revolution Foods, which is doing sort of healthy school lunches. So yeah, there's a community, but there's even more interestingly, if you want to trace the roots of, again, if you want to think of this corporate social responsibility as a movement, it actually goes back to this little gathering of small startups called Social Venture Network back in the mid-1980s. I think they sat around a hot tub in Colorado or somewhere at their first meeting. I'm not making this up. That's how it actually worked.
Tubs were on orgasm.
You got to liven this up a little. But anyway, no, the relevance is this Social Venture Network, which was Ben & Jerry's and Anita Roddick and Stonyfield Farm, eventually spawned Business for Social Responsibility, which I'm sure you all know was the idea of, well, let's have a church in which sinners can come worship as well as the kind of the pure. And so this is sort of the kind of intellectual underpinning of all this really did start with these sort of 60s hippies turned business people.
So let's keep talking a little bit about how do we expand the thought leadership on this. We've talked about this small group of like-minded leaders who continue to get together in various forms. But I can remember when I was at Booz Allen, I see Brad sitting there, going to the Center for Corporate Citizenship conference and being inspired by some really incredibly thoughtful and what I thought be progressive CEOs. And it's almost a question for Brad, but I'll pose it to you. Maybe, Brad, you could jump in, is what's happened perhaps, particularly I think in the last half decade, to either accelerate that trend or maybe it's decelerated somehow. I don't know. I posed the question to you, what are you thinking, and any response from the audience as well.
Well, I think what's happened in the last 5 or 7 years is these ideas have definitely moved into the mainstream. So if you want to think about what are the 3 or 4 most influential companies in the US, I guess I would say, having thought about it, this isn't off the top of my head, they would be GE, IBM, Walmart, Google, for different reasons. So GE, incubator of management, Walmart, sheer scale, you have to pay attention to Walmart if you're in the consumer products business. IBM, very adaptive company that has kind of reinvented itself over the years. And Google is kind of the symbol of the digital success companies. Well, all of those companies are very front and center about their corporate role. IBM has this big marketing campaign around smarter cities and smarter planet. GE, of course, with eco-imagination, health imagination. Google, don't be evil. Walmart, sustainability work, which I take very seriously. So the sort of thought leadership is coming from these big, powerful, influential companies, and I think that's good. I guess the worry I have is who's pushing the edge. A sad fact is that despite eco-imagination, Walmart, sustainability, the Prius, recycling, and everything else you've heard and read, inconvenient truth about climate change over the last 10 years, we're completely losing that battle. Every year, every day, emissions go up. Essentially, we've made no meaningful progress. So my worry is that the commercials about eco-imagination and smarter planet, and I don't blame them for this, but that they are going to obscure the seriousness of the problem and the sort of, one thing I really don't like about business is the sort of, I've never met a company with a problem, have you? They all have challenges. They all have opportunities. I hate the rhetoric of corporate America. I hate the rhetoric and I hate the bureaucracy. Those are the 2 things that drive me crazy. And so I worry about, trusting too much to the IBMs, GEs, Walmarts, and Googles of the world because they don't talk English most of the time.
Well, that's the job of the journalist. And the other job of a journalist isn't normally to answer questions, but we've got one or a comment up here from Brad.
Well, more of a comment, I think, is that I think this is a fascinating issue. We're hearing a lot about American exceptionalism around the globe in terms of foreign policy, et cetera. But I think there is, sort of to your point, Mark, I think there is a sort of large corporate exceptionalism. That is, a GE and IBM or whatever have been so successful at what they've done over the years that they begin to adopt a policy that makes it more difficult for them to sort of be open to where they're heading and things like that. And so in interviewing CEOs around leadership, my thought and my observation was they sort of understand this. I mean, it's not something they don't understand. It's more a question of who's setting the rules for this. Who do they think has set the rules? And what astonished me is that they did not feel they could set the rules. So, for example, they know about short-termism. They understand how detrimental that is in many different ways. But they, at least the ones I interviewed, which are the Fortune 50, did not really feel that they could change the game, that somehow that's going to have to happen someplace else. So I think this leadership issue is interesting. I think we're seeing a lessening of leadership from what I can see. I mean, if we did a little survey, and we'd say, who is the CEO that is considered a leader in this space? It would be hard to put a name to it. It would be very difficult to put a name to that. Even though I could point to companies like GE, UPS, et cetera, who are doing some fabulous stuff, have great cultures, et cetera, they're not willing to sort of get out in front on this issue. There's no benefit to them as they see it right now. They see it sort of a little bit in terms of the sustainability, et cetera, but it only goes so far, which is why we're sort of losing that battle, because it really doesn't. So just some observations.
One of the things John, how much time do we have here? 20 minutes? I want to leave time for Q&A, but if you recall, some of you might have gotten an email from me prior to the conference asking you to send me questions that we might want to pose to Marc, and I pulled a couple of those, and
Okay.
I would like to get to those right now. And the first one is, Marc, I'd be interested to hear your comments on how businesses partner with faith-based organizations with a multi-faith workforce.
Well, so after the God and Business story came out, it got a lot of attention. It actually sold more issues than usual of Fortune, and so I had the opportunity to write a book about it, and it became this book, Faith and Fortune, which tried to speak about these issues in the language of not religion so much as sort of values, a little bit of spirituality, and I learned, not early enough to fix the book, but more or less after the fact, that was not the right language. That, you're just talking about how companies don't speak English. They really don't speak religion. And they don't want to hear it. In fact, I interviewed the CEO of UPS at the time, Mike Eskew, for the book, and he wouldn't even tell me what church he went to, because he felt that would be, in some way perhaps might make someone in the company uncomfortable. Now that was an extreme example, but so I don't think it's wise probably for companies to partner with faith-based organizations. And on this question of language, I also don't really write about corporate social responsibility anymore, and I don't love the citizenship language that GE has embraced and Boston College has embraced either. You get into sort of complicated issues of personhood there, which, that starts to get political quickly. I think sustainability, I've come to decide, for me anyway, is the best language because it embraces both the social set of issues, the environment. It's somewhat become synonymous with green. That's too bad, but it really is about economic, social, and environmental sustainability. And if that's the frame you take, I think you get to the right place on most of the questions pretty quickly. And I've kind of come to believe that the religion thing is what you have in your heart, and it can certainly shape you during the day, but it's not something that is really proper discussion once you're inside the walls of the workplace.
This has been fascinating. We've ranged from way up here to kind of
To way down there. Yeah.
This is kind of a practical question, but yeah, actually we did kind of go down there. Didn't we? But this is kind of a practical question, but one that came up this morning. We've talked about it all the time at the conferences, and this comes from one of the folks in the room. I'm not going to identify who it is. Basically, we have a wonderful company, great culture of giving, but senior management does not believe in using company time for volunteerism, employee volunteerism. How do we, as CSR reps within a company, build a case to promote, quote, compassionate capitalism to our senior management? So I don't know that this is really about
it's a good question.
Employee volunteerism and time off as much as it is how do we make the case for this thing we're calling social responsibility, sustainability, whatever.
Well, that's a different question. I think the question about volunteerism is an easy. I mean, you make the case in a whole. That's what we've been talking about the whole time. You make the case in terms of, imbuing your workforce with a sense of purpose. There's a million reasons to make the case for long-term thinking and sustainable behavior. The volunteerism thing is an interesting question, which is once you give people time off work to volunteer, are they volunteering anymore? They're sort of volunteering someone else's time in a sense. So I don't know what the business case is for that, but I have sort of two sort of things from my own experience to relate more than reactions to that question. The best example of corporate volunteerism that I ever saw was a day I spent with Timberland employees about 10 years ago working on a women's shelter in New York where they had a bunch of people from all the New York stores painting and renovating the shelter, and they also invited a bunch of people from Macy's, which was a big distributor, retailer client of theirs, to come and do it together. So all these people are like, getting dirty during the day, and I don't know if they went and cleaned up. I didn't go to the dinner. Then they had dinner at, I think one of the really nice Danny Meyer restaurants in New York at the end of this day. And the Macy's woman, according to Jeff Swartz, who was then running Timberland, said, so, Jeff, what was this? Was this like a sales thing, or was it a do-good volunteer thing? And he basically said both. He said, a lot of companies will take the client to Yankee Stadium or to the opera for entertainment. This is sort of who we are. He knew the Macy's folks cared about the women's issue. That was sort of front and center for them. So it's sort of team building, sales, and doing good all, and then a nice meal out at the end of the day, all in one day. That just seems smart and strategic, and the business case for that would seem really evident to me. And the other one that occurs to me with that is, this isn't exactly to the question of volunteerism, but Google gets a lot of credit for giving their employees, I forget, maybe is it 1 day a week, their engineers to work on projects of their own making, which sounds like a very Silicon Valley thing to do, but 3M has been doing this for decades. So what's that exactly? Is it an employee benefit? Is it sort of R&D inside a big company? I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think really creative things have come out of that at both Google and 3M. And I just wonder if other companies that weren't necessarily technology companies said, we'll give everyone one afternoon to figure out some way to make our business better, to come up with a new product, to eliminate bureaucracy. GE organizes these treasure hunts where their employees go out with, I think, other companies and find energy efficiency, ways to save energy at a company. Let people sort of step outside of their role now and then and use their full set of talents and ideas to help the company. That's not employee volunteerism, but it's again saying, I recognize that you're not just the guy in accounting, or you're not just the IT person. You're a person who may have a lot of other ideas and skills and talents, and bring them to work and tell us what you think.
But it is employee engagement.
It is, it's absolutely employee engagement at sort of, I think, the highest level.
Right. I'm Gail Butler with AutoNation, and we won a national award, I'm very proud to say, for giving our employees only an hour a week, but it was to either mentor a child in a school or mentor your own child in the school, spend time with your own child, and that's valuing employees. I wanted to go back to your sustainability thing and tell you just one brief story. When gas went up before to $4, everybody went crazy. And so we put a lot of small cars on our lots. We have 257 new car dealerships across the United States, so we were full of new cars. The second gas went down, we could not give them away. Okay, so much for that. Everybody wants 25% of the people come into our dealerships and ask, they say, we want to see a Prius, or we want to see a Volt, or we want to see whatever, you know, yeah, exactly. Only 2% of the people walk out with it because it's more expensive. It's like we want cheap goods, but we want them made in America, but cheap goods are made in China. You know, I mean, so much for, we believe in sustainability, but it comes down to economics.
It does, and you know that's maybe the next, you know, maybe the next wave. It isn't very exciting from a corporate, you know, from an employee engagement standpoint, but maybe the next wave of sustainability has to be the top CEOs of the most important companies going to Washington and saying, change the rules. Now, they tried that, actually. They tried that with this, you know, climate action partnership of 2008, 2009, where, you know, GE and BP and, you know, lots of probably 15 to 20 companies and environmental groups said we need to do something about the climate issue. Because the reason, you know, the reason gas cars are cheaper today than electric cars, there's sort of two reasons. One is battery prices are really high and there's not scale and they don't seem to be coming down very fast. But the other is the external costs of the you know, internal combustion engines are just not captured. I mean, climate pollution is a cost, but no one's paying the cost. You know, simple soot and all those other kinds of pollutants are a cost that no one's paying. I don't go so far as some of the you know, liberal groups as to say the wars are part of a cost, but certainly if you could envision a situation where we didn't have to import oil, our foreign policy would probably look a little different than it does now. So, you know, maybe, you know, and I was actually at Shell last week, and it was kind of a very interesting conversation that I had with one of their top executives about natural gas, and he kept saying, natural gas is better than coal, it's going to cut emissions by 50%, and that's certainly absolutely true, but it's also going to, at the cheap price it is now, pretty much make it very hard for wind or solar to grow at all. And he had, you know, so I said, you know, do you have any second thoughts about essentially taking all this natural gas out of the ground as well as oil from Alaska and burning it? And essentially what he said to me is, you know, that's my job. I mean, if you make the rules differently, I'll do my job differently. But my job, we're a shareholder-driven organization. We're an oil and gas company. Our job is to deliver that if we don't believe it's priced properly. I mean, they favor a price on carbon. But that it's not really, this is sort of the limits. There's tremendous power of business, but there's also, you know, the limits have to do with what policy rules you're operating under and what your customers are willing to do. And your customers are not willing to pay extra for a cleaner car, unfortunately.
John, how much time do we have?
10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yep.
I'm going to ask Marc one more question, then we'll open up. And this is a very brief question. As a journalist, you must consume lots of information about things. At least one would hope. What blogs, what authors do you follow related to social responsibility and why?
Yeah, I mean, I am a big Twitter fan. So what I basically do, it takes up time, but I follow about 300 or 400 people on Twitter, and some of them seem to do nothing but be on Twitter. So I have a big stream. I try to look at it a few times a day. I try to scan through it, and that's the way I stay on top of what's going on. Now, I do look at the GreenBiz site because I contribute there, and I get, you know, an email newsletter from people like CSR Wire and Social Funds and
Who's here,
DSR
covering the
every day.
conference.
Yeah, I saw him on here before. So I look at those as well, but I do find Twitter to be a valuable way to stay on top of these, to stay on top of whatever your peculiar set of interests is. I remember, you know, in the media business, there was like talk in the dot-com boom of creating like a very personalized newspaper for everyone. So if you're a soccer fan and you know, come from Ireland and want to follow Irish politics, and you could get a personalized newspaper, but it never happened. But that's really what Twitter is. I feel it's a pretty good use of my time by following people who are intelligent.
We have about 7-10 minutes left. We want to leave time for questions, so let's go here.
John. Thank you, John.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Mary McDonald with Earthshare. Recently, and I know this has been coming for a while, the B Corp area has really begun to get a lot of attention, and it's a brand new area, really, but I'm wondering if you could look into your crystal ball and kind of see where that might go. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I was skeptical when I first heard about it and met the folks who are doing it. I don't think it's very, I don't think it's going to work for big public companies. I don't think they can restructure themselves. And I guess I should try to explain what it is, but I'm a little hesitant to do so because I'm sure I'll not get it exactly right. But it's legally a new form of corporate ownership that allegedly solves the problem of companies that want to do something that might pay off in the long run, but in the short run would cost their shareholders money, and their shareholders could sue them if they were unhappy. So it's a new form of ownership that says you can take into account your social and environmental impact as well as your bottom line impact when making decisions. So they've got a lot. They've done really well marketing the idea, and they've gotten a lot of small companies to sign up, and they've gotten, I think, you know, I'm guessing between 5 and 10 states to pass legislation, you know, creating this new form of incorporation, Michigan, New York, and some others. So it's interesting. It's an interesting way to raise the issue, and it may become kind of a brand for the, you know, Honest Teas. Sungevity, a solar company in California, I just saw last week, is a B Corp. So it's sort of a signal to customers and employees that we're about more than profits. But I think, you know, that's the signal that every company that's smart is sending.
One of the businesses that has been out there and operating in that kind of hybrid space for years are business cooperatives. You know, credit unions, rural electric co-ops, and with a lot of success. And actually, I know this is the year of the co-op, and they've been leveraging that a lot, particularly credit unions, in the juxtapositioning against the banks. And are there other business models out there that you've seen that have any potential?
I mean, I guess when I write, and in general, I try to think about scale. So the question is, can these things ever really get big and have an impact, or is their impact likely to be more the effect they have on big existing things? So, you know, I was around in the 60s. I remember going into the food co-op, and you had to work for 2 hours, and, you know, anyway, it didn't suffice it to say it didn't scale. It sort of became Whole Foods eventually, which did scale.
More questions? Come on.
We can wrap up.
Here we go, Mark.
I'm kind of interested to dial back to what you were talking about in terms of the millennials and the new workforce and all that. And we actually were having a conversation over lunch about sort of the idea of structure. And as these young people have hit the workforce, in many cases, you know, Cal and I two old guys talking about, going out and finding your friends and getting your own baseball game together when we were 7 versus when you're 7, going through all of these very laid out activities. And I was wondering if you might sort of comment on how you see that need for structure, the demands of the millennial generation and the expectations, the high expectations of their employers, but the lack of structure that they might be facing in their employers. How do you see that sort of gulf overcome when they come into the workplace, and how do you think harnessing that energy might work?
That's a great question. I've never heard that asked before, but in other words, and I'm not going to be able to really give you an informed answer, but you're right. These kids were programmed all the time, and I wonder when they show up at work if they want to be told what's happening at 10 and 2 and 5 o'clock. I don't know. I guess I hope not, and certainly in college everyone learns to autonomy and freedom. That's one thing that happens at that stage of your life. And the thing I hear from people, again, the ones I talk to are young employees, and a lot of the ones I talk to have tended to have left big companies, because I wouldn't tend to talk to someone who's just like a low-level person starting at a company. They might have gone to start their own company. But we were talking about this at lunch. I think the thing that really frustrates younger people, and it probably frustrates older people too, but the older people have gotten used to it, is bureaucracy. Some very smart, talented people I know have walked out of companies that are where they might have had good opportunity because they just didn't like the meeting to prepare for the meeting to prepare for the meeting. And there's just a lot of that in big companies. I mean, it's bad in government, but it's really bad in big companies too. So I don't know if any of you have any power over that, but if you do, and Jack Welch was great at GE, at least his rhetoric was good about this, but I really think it's the enemy of energy, passion, innovation, all the good things you want to promote, bureaucracy and process. Talk about it. My wife works in the nonprofit world. The process and the meetings there are just, they just stifle people. So that's not part of the CSR or sustainability world, but boy, oh boy. I mean, I get it just as a reporter, before you get to interview the CEO, we have to trade 16 emails and have 3 conference calls. And it's like, no, life's too short.
This has been very insightful, Marc. We appreciate your time. Like I said, we've gone from a very ethereal and look down to the practical and everything in between. Why don't you give yourself a crass commercial announcement about your blog?
Oh, yeah. Well, I will mention the blog, which is markgunther.com, but I'll also do a 30-second commercial for a new book that I've just written, which may be of some interest to people here. It's in my first Amazon ebook Kindle single. It retails for $1.99.
Rocketing to the top of the charts.
It's not going to bankrupt anybody. It can be read in about an hour or 90 minutes. It's not a full-length book, and it's about climate change and how to think about it differently and a potential new solution to it, which is capturing CO2 out of the air. So the name of the book is Suck It Up. How capturing carbon from the air can help solve the climate crisis. It's actually my attempt to say something optimistic about climate change, which is obviously a big and important issue where most of the news has been bad. I think the technology and the people I write about in this book, Bill Gates is one of them, are kind of a reason for hope. So there you go.
With that, thank you, Marc, so very much. We appreciate it.